In 1903, the US had signed a treaty with the Cuban government that granted them lease to the land now used for the Guantanamo Bay detention camp. Nowadays, the Cuban government considers the US presence illegal and claims the treaty was forcibly signed under threat. Some historians and lawyers consider it voidable. The US has used that land to imprison terrorists who do not act under the banner of a nation's armed forces, claiming that the protections that the Geneva Convention grants to prisoners of war do not apply to these prisoners. Hundreds of them arrived without a trial, without substantial evidence against them, and without the possibility of release. Many of these prisoners were children. Many have since been found innocent or released without charges, and many other organizations have confirmed that bizarre sexual humiliation and torture that yields false confessions were routinely happening to the prisoners inside. That is the setting for Ground Zeroes. To say that this is one of the heaviest and most politically loaded games in the series would be an understatement. This is one of the heaviest and most politically loaded games, period. It's drenched in some of the most controversial symbols of contemporary and historical American politics. The Guantanamo Bay setting, the black hooded prisoners of Abu Ghraib, even the creepy song about the Sacco and Vanzetti trials dig a dagger into dark parts of American history. But saying that Ground Zeroes gracefully tackles these very serious news topics would totally be an overstatement. Ground Zeroes could have been the emotional, mature, Guantanamo-inspired tragedy that it wants so hard to be if it weren't for the existing Metal Gear Solid canon. Now, before you go off on me and say that I'm a horrible person for hating on Ground Zeroes, let me make a few things clear. I liked Ground Zeroes, I had a lot of fun with it, and I also felt all kinds of weird, conflicting, emotional human feelings, so I mostly think it did its job well. But I am also fully capable of being able to enjoy something while also being aware of its flaws, and Ground Zeroes is far from flawless. The longer the Metal Gear Solid series goes on, the more you see just how much it actually is wearing down on Kojima. The unconventional tone, presentation, and content of the story in Ground Zero seems better suited for a new IP rather than an older one, and the tone of this game is incredibly far removed from the previous entry in the series. Yet nearly every detail of this storyline is based on the events of a secret optional ending from the previous game in the series. Peace Walker was very cartoony, very silly, and uncharacteristically T-rated for a Metal Gear Solid game. It was aimed at a younger audience, and while Ground Zero certainly is not, it's still a direct sequel to this.
A talking cat!
So let's begin by recapping. Snake raises a private army without borders that develops a nuclear-equipped giant fighting robot, and this girl in her underwear betrays him and hijacks it because...
Once upon a time, there were two young men who idolized a hero called the Boss. One day, they suddenly lost the point of origin, the cipher. Unable to come to terms with their sorrow, they each decided to carry on the will of their hero. In the end, they became bitter enemies. And the zero from which they both started was split into two.
So Snake defeats the robot and she ejects out into the ocean, but eventually she's found by a fisherman, one thing leads to another, and she ends up in Guantanamo. So Snake's people make plans to rescue her, not because they like her, but because she knows about Cypher and their giant nuclear robot, and they don't want that information to leak out. Meanwhile, Chico was searching all over Cuba after her because in the last game he developed a puppy love towards her, and he also ends up getting captured at Guantanamo. From his collectible tapes, we learn that Skullface tortured him into revealing the location and weak spots of Big Boss's base, which he then flies off to do under the disguise of a UN nuclear weapons inspection. And that's kind of a quick sum up of what happens in Ground Zeroes. I did like how the reveals in Chico's tapes added a nice layer of dramatic irony to the plot. After playing the game over and over again for a few times, you realize that Kaz really should be thrashing about and screaming at Chico instead of Paz, but it still kinda makes sense because of the series canon. In the last game, Paz was totally this evil mastermind directly sabotaging their base for just 15 minutes of the secret ending, which you had to get by playing all the side ops and grinding away at the AI pod battles and coincidentally finding Zadornov on the second floor of one of the very first missions. Anyways, I hope you understand what I'm digging at here. You have to unlock that plot through hard gameplay, and now in Ground Zeroes, that plot involves giant fighting robots and underweared evil masterminds cavorting around in the Guantanamo Bay detention camp. And I get that Metal Gear Solid is all about juxtaposing Tom Clancy-style military realism with Marvel-style fantasy, but Guantanamo is such an anachronism here. The game takes place in 1975, but the Guantanamo in real life started as Camp X-Ray in 2002. This place can't really exist in a pre-9/11 setting. Well, I mean, it obviously can because it does in the game, but it never really felt appropriate. The ridiculous politics of the Metal Gear Solid universe stick out like a sore thumb in a place that is full of the very not ridiculous politics of real life. Previous games were either set early enough in the series timeline to not have to deal with the same sequel baggage that Ground Zeroes has to deal with, or they used campy or humorous elements to disarm the player before the heavy-hitting emotional moments come and take you by surprise. Which is kinda why I think the jungle setting of Metal Gear Solid 3 works so well. It's playful. It's supposed to be Cold War Russia, but nowhere in Russia actually looks like this, so the game has an unrealistic setting with more room to surprise you as it switches back and forth between campy and serious tones. And with a lot less of that camp in Ground Zeroes, you have less room for it to be that kind of emotional roller coaster. This version of Guantanamo is uncompromising in its depiction of the cold, passionless, dehumanized utility of what is a very controversial real-life location. So instead of being a back-and-forth rollicking adventure between highs and lows, we just kinda stick to the lows with this one. Which does make sense since we're watching Big Boss turn into a villain in this game, but now, because of that, the silliness looks more out of place than ever. Like the iDroid thing, that's really weird and ridiculous. It's also weird how Chico has a headphone jack in his chest they never explain. It's weird how Skullface has a high-tech laser paint stripper thingy, and how these weird digital artifacts that look like lens flares but aren't really lens flares keep showing up, or how the crazy Japanese love deterrent song from Peace Walker plays in the middle of Chico's tapes, or why Chico is able to stand in the helicopter even though he has bolts through his legs, or what a pseudo-historical recreation is supposed to mean, or how canonical the side ops are supposed to even be, or why one of your MSF soldiers quotes Skullface as using the same exact line about pain that Snake uses in Peace Walker.
Nothing to be ashamed of. Pain gets the better of us all.
A lot of that stuff seems like stuff that'll get explained in Phantom Pain, and that doesn't bode well for Ground Zeroes. Ground Zeroes does not stand on its own as a self-contained story, which, again, is an unfortunate side effect of being a precursor spin-off to a much larger story. In the beginning of the first act of a classic 3-act story structure, you have something called the inciting incident, where something probably bad happens to the hero and it establishes the motive and the stakes for the rest of the adventure. It's when Luke's ranch is attacked, or when the Total Recall machine starts breaking, or when the tornado blows Dorothy away, or whatever. And Ground Zeroes is basically the inciting incident for the Phantom Pain. We've already been told that the next game begins with a wounded Big Boss waking up in a hospital years later, and what better way to set up for that than with a helicopter crash? We've been told that he'll have to raise his private army one more time, and I guess that's because his last private army got blown up in Ground Zeroes. We're being told that he's out for revenge against Cypher, and I guess that's because Skullface's master plan was to use Paz to have Snake and Miller blaming Cypher for the destruction of Mother Base when it was really Skullface. Oh, and by the way, even though this is all a terrible thing happening to this guy, it's hard to feel sympathy for him. I guess that's yet another problem that comes with writing a protagonist who turns into a villain. It's hard for me to root for this guy, especially when I can hardly blame the quote-unquote bad guys for wanting to blow up his private army.
Document destruction and hangar decontamination are complete. AFVs have been stowed away, and Zeke's on the seafloor along with a nuke. Everyone's got their story straight.
I really like that line. I really do. It has brevity, and it also has lots of depth. In just a few words, you really get a sense of how warped this guy's moral compass is. You get a huge understanding of what Big Boss and his men have to hide. You know what they're guilty for, and you know they're trying to cover it up and lie to people about it. No good person should have a to-do list that includes document destruction. When your daily schedule starts to resemble that of Saddam Hussein circa 2003, you are probably far down the path to the dark side. Unfortunately, it means that your autobiography will probably make less sense the more giant robots and evil masterminds it has in it, but I digress. The inspiration here seems to be Sacco and Vanzetti. That's where Paz's favorite song comes from, which Skullface uses against her. It's from a 1971 Italian dramatization of the Sacco and Vanzetti trial from 1921, when two Italian-American anarchists were convicted of robbery and murder. Halfway through the movie, one courtroom speech in particular stood out to me.
Perché ci è andato?
Perché sono un operaio anarchico!
Bravo, Sacco! Zitto!
Che significa?
Significa che gli anarchici pensano ad un mondo senza frontiere.
Capisco.
Noi siamo obiettori di coscienza.
Lei lo ama il governo degli Stati Uniti?
Io non amo il governo degli Stati Uniti.
Per questo lanciate bombe contro i ministri, i banchieri, lo Stato.
Io non ho mai lanciato bombe. Io non ho mai sparato a nessuno.
Lei non lancia bombe. Non crede nelle bombe, allora?
Io credo nell'anarchia.
Ma che razza di anarchia è quella in cui lei crede, signor Vanzetti? Lo vuole spiegare alla corte?
Anarchia significa libertà, abolizione della società divisa in classi, rispetto degli altri.
Basta!
Per me,
Basta!
queste sono le cose che contano nella vita. E su queste cose io ho cercato di vivere la mia vita.
The implication of that movie, and of the popular sentiment at the time, and again much of it throughout history, was that Sacco and Vanzetti were innocent. The evidence brought against them was inconclusive and weak, and they had a confirmed alibi, but they were passionate anarchists. And the implication of the film is that the US government had to make an example of them to strike a blow against the anarchist movement. So the film and the actual court case both serve the message that the US government is one that murders the innocent.
Immigrants wrongly executed, but their deaths served as a message to others that ours is a society that murders the innocent.
Both Ground Zeroes and Sacco begin with a long tracking shot showing the route away from a prison. Both tell the story of transnational anarchists whose lives are destroyed by the US government to make an example out of them. But all of that sympathy that comes with murdering the innocent shouldn't apply to Big Boss and his crew. Big Boss is not innocent. He runs a nuclear-equipped commercial mercenary company who operates outside of any nation's legal jurisdiction. The entire business model depends on the wealthy and belligerent nations of the world being at war with one another, while he's free to get away with whatever else he wants. His operation is funded by blood money, he recruits child soldiers, and he's hiding nuclear weapons from the UN. And it's not like he didn't see this coming either.
So what happens to us now? We'll be hunted. They're gonna come knocking real soon.
So, one more thing I don't like about this story. The collectible tapes, they have revelations in them, and they are entirely optional and easily missable. A full, well-rounded, sensible understanding of this story is something that's locked away as an optional collectible item, which means that the story you get without collecting those items is less complete. Although the cutscenes and the writing of Ground Zeroes are edited better than your usual Metal Gear, it still indulges in Kojima's crutch for long-lasting exposition, because now all that exposition is hidden away as collectibles. This time, most of the 10-minute passive story sequences come in the form of audio tapes rather than cutscenes, which I think is kind of a downgrade. At least with the cutscenes, you had something interesting to look at. Well, hopefully you did, that was the idea. Metal Gear Solid 4 had the opposite problem because so many of its cutscenes dragged out for so long that it literally ran out of interesting things to show you, so it just played a slideshow instead. These audio tapes are a kind of compromise to make the information that would have previously been revealed in codec conversations available in a more active format for the player, but it doesn't really work. It's just a few steps away from opening up an MP3 file through a browser. You can choose which exposition dump you want to hear at any time, yet you get none of the interactive Easter eggs of the codecs, and it's mostly gonna be monologues. Kiefer Sutherland must be one hell of an expensive voice actor because we're not getting much in the way of two-way conversations here. You can walk around and listen to these tapes while playing the game, but they drown out the positional sound effects of the guards, which will inhibit your ability to play skillfully. And what is unintentionally hilarious is that even while the tapes are playing, Kaz will still try to talk through them. What is fun about the tapes, though, is that they allow Kojima more chronological freedom with his writing. They can be historical artifacts found by the player out of order. It was satisfying to piece together the puzzle of the story by collecting them. It gradually reveals smoking gun evidence to theories I had suspected hours earlier. It felt good to be more actively involved in the unveiling of this story. But nevertheless, it was incredibly awkward that that was happening hours after the ending credits of the game. And again, cutting that content out for only the most dedicated players means that everyone else is going to get a more incomplete story. That was the same issue with the Peace Walker ending. You had to seriously grind away for hours, if not days, just to get an actual conclusive and satisfying resolution to the story of the game. And for Metal Gear Solid games, that's really weird. These are all very densely told, story-driven games where a lot happens in a short span of time. Except now, many of the most relevant details are hidden away as unlockables that require grinding and repetition to uncover. And I'm not a fan of that. And it still highlights the infamous video game mismatch between the tone and the content of the story and the mechanics that reveal that story. It felt like a worthy and fun challenge to unlock secret little snippets of story reveals that turned out to be the crippling psychological torture and rape of a 13-year-old child and his older crush. Was it tasteful, maturely executed, and not gratuitous at all? No, it wasn't any of those. Well, it was handled better than how video game stories usually handle this topic. Paz is richly characterized both before and after the event. She doesn't treat it as some kind of pseudo-death, worse-than-death murder at the end of her character until she blows up.
Now for the second one. In a place they'd never look.
Oh. And it has nothing to do with the motivations and actions of our own protagonist, in this game at least. But knowing that it was being done by a guy named Skullface so that he could blow up a giant walking mecha robot that exists because Big Boss previously blew up another giant mecha robot that was infused with the resurrected soul of his dead mentor, that stuff is why it's hard to take a rape scene in Metal Gear Solid seriously. What it was awkward. Really fucking awkward. And I think, more so than the seriousness of the situation, was the effectiveness of the awkwardness. It was an effective juxtaposition between the positive feelings of being rewarded for skillfully mastering what is gradually revealed to be a repulsive and despicable experience over and over again. It's being told through the eyes of a punished villain protagonist while he waits, comatose and disfigured, for something worse to happen, while ruminating over the incredibly shaky memories of this inciting incident. But then you get to the side ops, with their over-the-top Rambo-esque trigger-happy exploits and Kojima self-insertions and console-specific alternate universe tie-ins, and then you go back to Ground Zeroes, and the experience is akin to making out during Schindler's List. It's something that makes you feel guilty, dirty, and shameful, despite actually being a hilariously ridiculous story to tell when you look at it from an outsider's perspective. Although Ground Zeroes does have a competently designed and profound and sobering anti-American message about imprisonment and torture, it suffers from being a Metal Gear Solid game. The players, the character we're playing as, and the real life and fictional influences it's all based on are just dealing with the unwanted inevitabilities of fate. This game has you breaking prisoners out of Guantanamo who are scheduled for indefinite detention. It has you deifying the anarchism of long dead and almost forgotten martyrs. It elaborates on the backstory of an 8-bit mustache twirler from 1987. And more than anything else, it tries really hard to carve a new direction for canon that is burdened by 25 years of existing inside an increasingly ridiculous universe.